So the mind state of coming up with EPL, esoteric principles of light, this all the way down to the symbol is to say you don't have the right to make a symbol to proclaim that a Masonic symbol just because people blindly follow the Freemasons or the Eastern Stars or Mormonism, that eventually you'll learn that there are no principles involved. In fact, it is a recruitment process for the Stoic, and Christianity is the Stoic religion that feeds into a blind faith system. Even though you act like you don't have faith, you have to have faith in something to know that you're going to get your paycheck every couple of weeks, right? Or that your job description isn't going to change all the time. That in itself is faith, right? And you could say, no, there's a reliance on a brotherhood. And so that's really what the morals and dogma, what Masonry is all about. It's about these principles that really aren't anything more than the proletariat's work code. That's really what it is. And then if you prove yourself to be more than that, you're going to have to face the things that are depicted in the Masonic artwork and the Rosicrucian artwork and the tarot. You're going to have to face, like they call it, a dark night of the soul, the shadow self. You're going to have to understand that there are different levels to this, and that by realizing that you are not worthy of these higher principles. In fact, you couldn't even understand them. That these lower tier principles are thus what you would accept. And then you're supposed to get bought out, basically, as a member of society that is then on track to have all the things that your boss, your supervisors have, whether or not it's having an apartment or a house or being respected in your township. But it's all set up not as a form of principle. It only looks like that on the surface. So EPL was looking at it all the way down to the symbol, the sigil, saying, no, you can't take this six-pointed star, this hexagram, right? And you can't say that you've acquisitioned this for a better use. You haven't. And I'm going to find the principles that should have been existent in and readily available in the Masonic handbook. That you should be handing these things out. There shouldn't be any cryptic or covert mechanism where when you get down to the bottom of it, it's Lucifer and Satan. No, fuck you. Now, these are the principles. So in searching for the principles, the only thing that you could do is come up with purity. That's it. Searching high and low, looking within, looking without. What is the uniform principle that nothing can compare to, that keeps, that should have been hailed as the top level, the highest esteemable, at least something to go toward and to move further, to have more within us, to have without, to move towards, that we would move toward this purity. But instead, it uses anti-principle, the Freemasons and on, right, all the way down to Christianity, to create all these loopholes where when you're reading the Old Testament, you're exposed to certain performance attributions, just with the references of the serpents and the snakes, even in the Garden of Eden, right? You're looking at ophism. You are looking at a break-off in the worship of Cain and the line of Cain and the succession of Cain. If you read your Bible real carefully, you'll see right there the metallurgy, the makeup, all the way up to Tubal Cain. You're going to see that. It's a story. It's a depiction. It's an acceptance. And now you've gotten to the point where on the surface you could say, oh, what do you want to do? Go live in the Sentinel Islands? Or do you want to live more tribal or barbaric? Well, good luck getting in there, because they will arrest you, right? So what nobody's really talking about is the fact that there is no refuge. There's no place to go. If you want to drop out of society, if you don't want to be a part of this very satanic, Satana, Prometheus, if you follow the line of succession there, all the way into Mithraism and Medea, right? If you really follow this whole line of succession, it leads into this dark cult or a dark occulted religion, right? Where you will do what we say, and then for you to even ask and to look upon the ugliness of that person, that central figure, that agent, that entity, you wouldn't want to serve it, right? That we're talking about re-embodiment, we're talking about red bright rituals, we're talking about the selective process of reincarnation. That if you could believe in the Eye of Sauron, so to speak, if you could believe in Satan, if you could believe in any of these generals, so-called generals of hell, right, and just accept it and see what on the terms that it's presented to you, that no, we want you to have principles, right? Just like in the Masonry, you have to have a religion, you have to have a belief system because it shows belief. You're coming in with a certain proof, and you're saying you're going to give the Brotherhood just as much conviction as you do to your religion. Are you good at serving your religion? Well, learn to go through the process. Now we're going to give you the tow rope, and we're going to take you through the apprentice onto the master apprentice, and then you're going to be entered into this after you get through the first 3 stages of this. And for you to work your way up, well, we'll notice what your capacity is, what you're capable of, and we may set certain bars and standards for people, almost working as a caste system, and we may decide to give these credits or the potential to work up in this tier system freely, to where you are going to be honored and cherished if you bring to us somebody who will be able to esteem up to the highest levels, the 32nd, 33rd degree, right? So this used to be much more transparent. And when you get into the study of Rudolf Steiner, he really was talking about this. He wasn't like Manly P. Hall, which, you'd be hard pressed to say that Madison Grant and the passing of the great race and all of the sort of hints at eugenics weren't in line with what Manly P. Hall pushes, right? That ultimately Albert Pike is talking about work in a very frou-frou sort of way, where you're supposed to, look at all these great philosophers, these historical archives, and then come to the realization that, wow, it's about me working. You're Stoic. That's why I posed the question, what would you rather be? Marcus Aurelius or Alexander the Great? Alexander the Great had to be killed because the philosophy, the Aristotelian, Platonic, Socratean philosophy lived in him. It culminated through him. And now that he had, and all the strange phenomenon that he was on a holy quest, that at 33 years old, he probably had come into his mind that all these things that I've done, I need to do this for principle, right? Well, Marcus Aurelius didn't even have this. He was a Stoic. He was good at following the order, right? That you are born into a society, you're given a religion, and you just accept it. You accept it on the terms that it's thrown before you. But Alexander the Great, through this philosophical, familiar transposition of energy, right, that there was a current coming through, and that he was keeping alive something that had to do with the basic, the pure principle. And you could say, isn't that what the Masons are about? And it's like, no, it's not. Because what was happening is that you had there's this rally between this Promethean, right, satanic, Ophism, Christianity. Really, you have to go off toward the Abrahamic traditions and religions there, and see that there would be a line of succession or regression to draw in those same people. Like, if this is your behavior and this is what you do, we will set up a society much like we have now, which I call the Masonic jungle, or the concrete Masonic jungle, right? Where you have this literal you have the Masonic temple, you have the library, you have the theater, you have the schools, everything's in line with one another. There's a geometrical structure to it. And that is the motherboard. That is and we are the carriers of that energy, right? That is us. We are those signal responses that's carrying and providing energy, right? And it is extremely spiritual because we're not just raw energy, but that is what we ultimately produce. We produce, much like a harmonic tone or music, we produce a specific type of energy. It is a type and a kind, right? And so what happened is there was an acquisition to say, look, are we just going to let these people reincarnate and do this stupid shit over and over again to the point where we know what they're going to do? We see the number and the symbol on their head, and we can see it from the other side, so to speak, with technology, from a liminal zone, from a liminal place, from a disincarnate place. Maybe they can see your very energy. I don't know. It sure seems like it. Seems like it's beyond a technological thing that's happening, right? To be viewed, to be charted, to be, and then the control mechanism is the bottom line. Is now that we are realizing that it wants us to sink, it wants us to fail, it wants us to regress back to the base, which is Stoicism at its base. It's like if you were born into a society that didn't want you to work in society at all. Everything that it offered was a dead end. Everyone that you were going to work with and for was ultimately going to be seen 100% revealed as nothing more than this sort of Stoic Masonic signature that is taking you back to a base where you're not able to aspire to higher principles. We know this because of the software it uses. We know this because of the money system, the transfer of the money system. We know this because of the affiliations with the place that you work at and the people that you work with. We know this because it exists in a fallen society, that it's part of the armature that sinks you back into the perpetual state, right, of reoccurring karma, a dharma, samsara, the same shit over and over and over again. So those who try to break free, no matter where their status is, if it's Alexander the Great or somebody who's washing dishes in a restaurant, to say, I am going to start speaking for principle, doing all that I do with principle, right? And infusing and imbuing my energy into my pure energy, my resolute state to say, I will not accept anything else but the pure truth. And the fact that society at large puts a red dot on my head and hunts me once they find out I'm not one of you brothers. I'm not a brother of the darkness. I'm not a brother of Cain, a Tubal Cain down onto Cain. I'm not a brother of a patron of Ophism, right? Which really leads back into this funneling of a very dark religious prospect that existed prior to Zoroastrianism that we talked about. And if you want to look further into this, you look at Jason Reza Giorgiani. But I would posture to say that Jason, as he's getting older, is beginning to see that in past interviews where he's like, yeah, if you want to call me a Satanist, yeah, I see no difference between Prometheus, and you take Prometheus further back, or you look at this idea expounded upon, well, it's Satan or Satana. Yeah, I'll go with that. And then you see, you're like, Jason, do you see in the scope of the last 8 years how your resignation to this and your attribution, what you think you've committed to, which I've gotten a lot out of. I've really enjoyed his work, but I have to read it with a certain filter or specter placed upon it, where I know that Jason ultimately is purposaciously approaching this, knows that I need to look at every little avenue and variable. But for you to make the pronounced statement that I'm a Satanist, I mean, if you're going to categorize me, it's not like I'm worshiping, I'm not Anton LaVey's idea of Satan, I'm not a dull, stupid practitioner, worshiping by night and wanting to be like a rock star, ignorant version of a Satanist. But I am, looking at it from a very measured way through all, my PhD and all these educational resources, as to say that, you cannot separate Prometheus from Satan. So yeah, you could call me that. And it's like you see what happens to people when you look at Amon Hillman, who Jason Reza Giorgiani is still friends with because, or professional comrades, you could say in a way, right? That he's actually very proficient and good as a sort of as a Greek scholar. Like that's what he understands, how to read and write in ancient. He knows how to use Greek, right? I don't know. I'm not the expert. I don't need to understand it fully, but he's looking at it, and then he was fired from his position as an academic teacher, a collegiate academic teacher. He's a doctor in language, I suppose, historical, history and language, as to say that he did these sort of sexual things that brought him before a board, and they ultimately decided, no, this is not professional. You can't work for us. And then that pretty much made it so he couldn't work in the academic field anymore. Now, if you look at him, he's wearing dresses, and he's trying to go against cultural norms and standards. He's trying to say, look, stand up and fight. But what you see someone who goes absolutely insane. Like there is no, so you have to ask yourself, is ultimate freedom seen in the expression of liberation? You could be whatever you want, therefore you'll wear a dress, therefore you'll wear a wig, therefore you'll create this cult where you have other people breaking free from this paradigm, from these norms as well, right? And you'll do it right out in front of people. They need to witness it, right? And he acts like witnessing isn't important, but he contradicts himself a lot, because I've seen enough of that stuff, and I'm watching this unmasking Amon Hillman, and I'm seeing the signs that I know of full well, because I've not only seen them outside of me, I've seen them in me, and I've seen the process that it takes you through, right? So it breaks you down, and ultimately you realize yourself as a slave, that you can't get out of it. You suffer for the long, and then obviously you just want to have a decent life. And at the end of it all, it's like, look, we'll recycle you back through, but you're not taking any more energy than is necessary. What it's doing, it's saying, we'd rather have 1 billion people, right, spreading out this entropy, barely being alive and going about this stoic mechanism of power and control, than one highly enlightened person that lives by way of pure principle and spreads this out, right, into the world and becomes a sun to the world, right? So you do have these depictions of Jesus. What Amon Hillman does is he bastardizes this, because he's looking at a lot of Gnostic archives, like the infant Gospels in Gnosticism. And you see the infancy Gospels, you see that Jesus actually gets pissed off when he's in grade school and kills somebody with his mind or his energy, because he has all. It's kind of like saying, well, he had to learn too, right? So the relevance of this, and the reason it's so important, is because you have to see that at the end of all this very academic, highbrow study and research, and you'll see that when you go through this process, when you're on this trail, it's very aware of where you are. It's not going to give scholarships. It's not going to give perks to those who are expounding upon and following and wanting pure principle to exist above all other measures. People who are being Robin Hoods, so to speak, who are looking at the loot and seeing the injustice that's being hoarded by the hegemony, and seeing the kakistocracy and saying, no, you know what? We're taking it back, but we're doing this with principles instead of monetary assets. However, you do get into this alchemical process with the gold and precious metals and things that we're not even really aware of, like Moscovium and what is it? Therium, I think it is. There's certain radioactive agents that are lesser used, right? So you're looking at a sort of a pecking order, but you're looking at a process that is vetting you out. But at the top of that vetting process, you as a pure principle uh, initiate, a person, and you don't even want to use those terms because there's no tier system, there's no order, there's no pecking order. Either you are living by way of purity or you are not. That's the bottom line with it. But then you have this multi-tier complex system when you look at the Masonic order, going into the Opus Dei, going into the Knights Templar, right? It's all the Knights of Malta. You look at all this bullshit, and it's so complex, right? And then you get into language models, and it's like, well, language models are this complex too. Look how we've interpreted these principles, and then used what you call false math, which comes primarily, in my opinion, from pi, from the measure of pi, the loop of pi, is to say now that you have phi or phi, it's no longer pi. It's the difference between 3.14 da, 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 and 1.618, right? They don't match, they don't marry back into each other. But what you do find in the Fibonacci is you find that swirling pattern, right? You find that swirling pattern, right? So, and you find in pi, it's a pie. It's round. It's circuitous. It is samsara. So without being redundant and talking about the same things over and over and over, it's EPO is really taking those principles that should be there in Christianity, rightly so. And I've looked in the Bible and I've used the EPO principles and I've found them there. So they do exist there. So that's why it has the phi or phi moniker imprint upon it, because it does have those higher principles, those things that kind of bring us back to this materia prima, this first substance, is from an ophist point of view, all the way down into the serpent worship and the cults that existed prior to, and the darkness of them, is that you're coming to this altar and you're coming to it, and then you see that as a pure man, just like a pure Komodo dragon, you're going to kill, you're going to murder, you're going to eat, and then in the sedentary process, so you're going to waste your time trying to culminate pure energy through ignorance and using intuition. And this is what it gets into. Using your intuitive processes that connect you to this zone, this place, but through faith, that make you look like an utter idiot from the outside, because these people that believe in rationalism, right? Pure rationalism, right? The nihilists, the agnostics, right? Down into the atheists, depending on how you view it, are saying, look, maybe the rituals and the religions are true, but they're still dealing with practical magic, if you will, in the sense that this is sex and this is an energy that's culminated through sex, right? So I'm going to use this. This is a lot of the stuff that Amon Hillman talks about, right? And that unavoidably, Jason Riza Giorgiani buries his head as an academic and a writer of books and continues on. But there is a point where he's only going to be able to use his life force so much that he's been given. You can see that he's rapidly aging, Like if you look at just 8 years ago, New Thinking Aloud, Jeffrey Mishlove interviewing him, and how young he looked and how he presented himself, and he was kind of on the board in the center where he's going, look, I don't know the answer, but I'm going to be a good historian, and I'm going to reach into the historicities of Iran and Persia and so forth. I'm going to look into this and Prometheus, but I'm going to keep a very neutral place in this, a neutral zone, right? Whereas now he's full on he's going through the same process that we all go through, where if you're alive, if you have blood coursing through your veins, what are you doing with it? More so, what are the energetics proving or providing toward? What is the central hub? And then he's saying, I'm friends with Iman Hillman, and I am a Satanist. He said this in interviews, and he doesn't say it with any qualms. It's kind of like, okay, so are you going to get? So what you have is you have people that are going on with the satanic panic, and they're not looking at this through the full disclosure of an academic discourse. But also, you see how academics will roll their eyes at you And then in their final breath, they'll begin to see and they'll begin to realize how important it is that you're not just looking at for first substance, materia prima, that could be, like Iman Hillman alludes to, is the way he says it explicitly. It's the ejaculate of the young male, the ejaculate to drink it. Yeah, look, I'm not saying that, and it disgusts me to say it, and it disgusted me to look at him saying it. I was looking further into what's this guy all about. I know he's evil. I can see it on him. But what is this curiosity that people like Danny Jones and even, Jason Reza Georgiani and many others, Gnostic informant, where it's kind of like the Gnostic informant is looking for the truth. He's good to go, look, how much of a theologian do you have to be until you're looking at this? And it's ultimately, the more information is just really a trap. It's a like the large language models and all the different languages and being polyglottal. What's it really doing for you? It's making you money. You look like an esteemed colleague. You look like you have tenure. You look from the outskirts. You look like you are a practitioner that is of matriculation, and that you are like Pythagoras. But ultimately, what you're doing is you're increasing your recruitment process to where now you have hundreds of students, and then when you're writing books, you're exposing yourself to thousands. And ultimately, when you get down to the basic statement and then the symbol, you have to admit the symbol that you serve. That is, the large language models reduced down into the rudimentary state of the expression of what they mean, the basic meaning, and you will come face to face with an altar. You will back up, and as you're walking to that altar that ultimately gives you the life force that you thought that you lost, right? And that you want so badly, and you want to return back into this life and be a teacher again. Where are you taking people with all that academic highbrow methodology? Where is it going? And as you approach that altar, you will see that it is shaped exactly like the inverted pentagram. And your blood, you're being in that, when they talk about a cavity or a caveat or like when you look at Monday or Mund, you're looking at a mouth or a mound. You're literally feeding in and allowing a spherical energy to exist hovering above the inverted pentagram. And now you are entered in. I see Christopher Lee like this. Like, you'll see him in all these roles that he played for a long period of time, right? But then you see that he was in the military. He was in more than one campaign, and he was serving out in a very stoic sort of way. He was serving the queen. He was serving the people. He was accepting his role. But we, those who are given a higher state or a higher status of being, i.e., the ability to teach, the ability to talk around the BS and bring people central to the core. Ultimately, what Iman Hillman teaches, what Jason Reza Georgiani teaches, and I'm not telling you not to, because ultimately the problem here is what I began this with, and that is the problem herein lies is that you if you're looking at this Bo, whatever the hell his name is, Joe Osteen, all these televangelists, they're leading you off a cliff in a direction, but all they really care about is preaching, putting on the surface this principle-oriented biblical stories, coercing you into the Old Testament stories that really lead you back into Ophism and so forth, Mithraism, right? And then Medea. And then it ultimately creates this confusion line where you're going, when you look at Iman Hillman, and I guess Neil with Gnostic Informant was saying that he had looked into this further and he couldn't have an academic conversation with Iman Hillman at some point where Iman Hillman concluded that the Bible was initially taken from Greek, right? That it actually, he was saying that it was written in Greek and translated over to Hebrew, whereas every other scholar, if I have this wrong, forgive me, but I'm not an expert in this area, nor do I claim to be a scholar in this, and I may get it wrong, but every other scholar has conclusive proof supposedly, when you look down deep into this, that the Bible was translated from Hebrew into Greek, and that, so his conjecture on this, the reason for it, was to say this is the pure essence of the reckoning. And even if you found one pivotal point that pointed toward more of an ophistic type worship, or a cult type worship, or to look at, like, he'll bring things up that most people wouldn't contend are in the Bible, but then he'll get deep into the verses, and most people think he's crazy. He's recruiting a lot of damaged people, most likely males. Like, it's looking very much like he may have been possibly a victim when he was young, that he may have been imbued with a certain spiritual essence that grabbed a hold of him, and the only way that he could have a rationale inside of him is that that he had to contend with the fact that like, I'm looking at certain authors, right? Certain authors that are very respected authors, particularly in the sci-fi world. And there's one guy in particular that I heard talking about, and I don't remember his name, right? Because I'm not particularly a sci-fi fan, but because my son is such a sci-fi fan, I look into it a little bit more. And then I find it very curious when I see that these authors are oftentimes expounding upon or developing certain physics principles that they're playing with, and you see it everywhere. Like, even if somebody, but what I'm discussing literally and specifically here is that there is one particular author that is regarded in such a high regard that he's won so many awards. Again, I don't remember his name, and if I click off of the video here, I won't be able to access it on this phone, right? I don't think I have it on my other phone. It would be good for me to be able to cite such an author if I'm talking about him, right? I don't even know where my other phone's at, but it's in my jacket. But it's a commonly well-known person. But he talks about, in the Bay Area, him at 13 years old getting this curiosity, going down to this pornographic theater, right? And then having his first homosexual experience there, right? But what he doesn't talk about is the fact that he was only 13 years old, that the boy that he was with, like, you're talking about a crime that's being committed. And this leads me in toward Nathaniel Gillis's work, because he makes it a very good point for us to look at. When you did certain things and you accepted it, you were being molested, you were being abused by spirits. What conjured you into these experiences that you have now accepted and tried to rationalize? And in that rational scope, you had found a language model that gave you pride, that gave you a prize, right, in society, that when you look at the totality of your life, you were sacrificing the purity within you. You are now campaigning and writing such strange sci-fi novels that are written so well that you're winning all these awards, but really you're bringing these people to this risque mechanism where they feel challenged and uncomfortable with certain themes that are when you choose purity, are entirely unnecessary, right? And so you're on one side, they're on the other, and we're all impure. And the body itself is bound to this, right? And there have been, so there's this grasping out, like Immanuel Hillman, at Jesus Christ. Say he wasn't pure. There's nothing pure or good about him. It's depicted and it's talked about in the Masonic playbooks, that where Albert Pike pronounces Adonai as a lesser god. That you're really looking at the Masonic stamp when you look at the Jesus family tomb and the ossuaries, and the fact that this goes even deeper. Like, who was that directed Avatar and all this, right? Wrote the foreword, James Cameron wrote the foreword to the Jesus family tomb, and it was written really well. But when you get into the final meat, that was like 2/3 of the book, because his foreword was huge. When you get into the meat of the book, it was written so poorly that nobody really took it seriously, right? But he wanted it to be taken seriously. He wanted to look at it, because what you had was, you had the Masonic stamp above the Jesus family tomb and the ossuaries, right? You had in the archives of the Gospel of Mary that Jesus kissed Mary on the lips, and that they were in fact a couple, right? So you get into this hot debate of whether or not this pure son, right? And what you're experiencing when you're praying is the purity within you. That what you're losing is you're existentially placing this historically outside of you, right? That's why it's a very dangerous thing to take this higher truth of the pure son and to put it into a name that may have very well been contaminated by the Masonic order from a very early time, that came from Cain. It went into Tubal Cain. It became the religion that they all worshipped, right? The sacrificing of the pure son. That invariably this pure son was using intuition, getting divine that was touching everything that the pure son touched was divine. But when it came down to conversations, you're not so smart. You're not thinking about weapons. You're not thinking about deep thoughts about the earth, but you're also not rejected by God, right? Because you murdered your own brother, or because you would murder your own brother, right? So, and you were also better than your brother in what you were there to offer God, right? And your sacrifice, the difference between meat, a very well butchered meat, and the land, the crops that you grew, right? And so when you look at it, we're talking about the meat, right? We're talking about the sacrifice of the lamb. We're talking about the what we eat every single day. While I was talking about this in a prior video, I was eating a hamburger. Right? We're talking about the fact that we're so deep into this that the science, the language, the intelligence that surrounds us is 100% contaminated, and it leads us into a loop. It seems like endless knowledge. It seems like Google. It seems like an infinite number system that just keeps going on and on and on, right? But the truth is it's redundant, and it's redundancy. And in that redundancy, you're then going to proclaim art, and your art through liberation and democracy, as something that should be held separate, that should be held up on a pedestal. You feel beautiful, so you'll act out beauty. In fact, you'll wear a mask, eyes wide shut. You'll get up on a stage and you'll perform such things, and it will liberate you, right? We're talking about liberation again, liberty, libertas. So instead of looking at the pure source and the reality that once you step up and once you step into the truth, that you will be killed, you will be rejected, you will be forgotten, you will be called a heretic, you will be called a failure. And that's why people like Thomas Aquinas and David Hume aren't talked about as much. You could arguably say that any of these people, once they put it into words and writing, become, if they can't expound upon to a larger language model, and even with like John Dee, you can't express this into a hieroglyphic monad, that you can't create some formulation, a symbol, right, a sign out of this. So that's why I found it important to not only expound upon the philosophy of what the good Mason would be doing, if they really were as they present themselves, right? If the Knights Templar hadn't fallen, right? If Christianity, especially the Old Testament, hadn't fallen to Ophism and then produced this form of a higher tier purification, where now you have to see that the Masons actually did these rituals and went a little bit further with the Masonic order as to blaspheme, and to create a very dark version of Christianity, of the Messiah, of a Jesus figure, as to say that once you translate this and put this into its antithetical view, once you've decrypted it and encrypted it through cryptology and learned the mechanism or the language of the way, you will see that Jesus was using sex magic. This is what Iman Hillman says, right? And this is kind of what Jason Reza Giorgiani is slowly matriculating up to, right? Where he's using a very challenging discourse. Now, can I say, with all absolution, as I sound like I'm preaching here about something that's so abstract and undefined, am I not in the same position as they are? Of course I am. Do I have any implication? Has there been anything but a sun that's shining, that's part of the earth, it's part of the world, it's part of this solar system? In fact, you look at this lining up of Venus that comes every 8 years, and it makes a perfect pentagram shape that, like, we're smack dab in it, right? We're smack dab in that energy. And we live on this 9-year cycle, because you get through the 8 years, and on that 9th year, you see the redundant loop, right? And you see what gives us life and why we sacrifice to these unseen gods for our crops. And that if we don't, and it's like, it gives a lot of credence to that, because as a Stoic, you're walking the line, right? But you're still delivering an entire country. You're still delivering an entire academic outlook of peoples at a time. You're still delivering, Marcus Aurelius was still delivering people's heads on a platter to this figure, because he was bound to the inverted pentagram, right? So again, my argument isn't necessarily leading people away from it. Like when my son, who has autism, talks about how he finds such relief in Jesus Christ, it's imperative that you existentially find this pure state that both exists within you and without, and that's the echo chamber that I want to stay in, and that's where I'm staying, and I'm not going beyond that again. That I've seen that if you step beyond this, it's aware of you, it's watching you, it's listening to you, right? Because you are following a mimetic sequence of numbers that everyone is following over and over again. And when you break that protocol, it's obvious, because you are a rare few of many. And so you get that Eye of Sauron on you, right? But even then, why is it so locked onto you, in the fact that it doesn't really change much when you believe in this, right? I've only seen perplexing things happen or taking place, where, you go around through the spiritual warfare, which is very real. You abolish, you destroy with so much concentration, imagining this. You destroy all these dark places that are superimposing themselves over actual geographic locations, and you can see it happen. You can see the darkness being lifted, and you realize you are, in a sense, a practitioner or a spiritual warrior, if you will, right? So that's where it slips into the left side or the right side. Practitioners really to the left side, warriors to the right. It's like you're not over, emphasizing the language models or trying to reinvent anything, trying to reinvent the wheel. You're over here on the right side, and you are being a warrior. You see it in front of you. If you can see the evil, you know it has to be abolished. The more that you can see it and interact with it, it's not supposed to be there. You've been given this sort of truth, which really isn't just a symbol. Like when you get into the cross, when you get into the sword, there's something there that is handed to. It's just like the Excalibur, King Arthur, all these Arthurian legends that lead back into these areas of Mithraism and so forth. That you're battling with these 12 characters. You're at a round table. You're sitting at this spherical field. You can't trust everyone, and you know there's a deceiver among you that's selling you out. What are you going to do? And so the ultimate story that's depicted over and over again is your brother will deceive you. Your brother will stab you in the back. But if you toe the line and you do this sacrifice in a systematic, ritualistic, religious measure, and you bring your brother who wants to be pure, because that's what's manifesting from these 12, right? Where you get this energy of these 12 people that are doing God's work, these Knights Templars, so to speak. And then you're watching, do we all fall together? Do we all start using Thelema and sex magic together? That Aleister Crowley later, when he was rejected from the Golden Dawn, he developed Thelema or Thelema. But this is taken from Dionysian worship. This goes way back, and so Jason Reza Giorgiani is a gem in current state or status, especially in his interviews, but I haven't read any of his works. But in his translations of them through Aeon Bytes, the Gnostic radio, you see them coming up with some really interesting discourse, right, in conversation. But this isn't here to entertain us. We are all going through this procession. We are all stuck in this chamber. So do you have those who are bound to the left, and do you have those who are bound to the right? Do you have these ancient depictions of this tug of war between the two forces? Do you have this? Jason Reza Giorgiani doesn't like the commercialized usage of Zoroastrianism or Zarathustraism as to transpose it into Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. He says that's more the genericized tradition right there, right? That you kind of have this Abrahamic influence with, you have to have. So basically what you're just looking at is good and evil, and you're looking at God and devil, right? Or Satan. But when you get into it, you the way that he describes it, you really don't have this. You have a central figure that really he points again back to this Promethean figure, that if you were to look at this in succession up to 500 years prior to Christianity, and of course after the Sadi, if that was his name, or the Zoroaster existed, right, that you see him as the forerunner to Jesus Christ, right, that are you talking about Prometheus, right? That there's a lot of illusions, and there's too many to ignore, that you see these ancient artifacts that hail to the pure Son of God long before Christianity came on the scene. So this was the type of thing that wasn't just an invention. It was science, and remains to be science to this day, because the deeper we go into this, the more we're looking at number systems and the manifestation of this pure source of energy as existent within numbers themselves, that allow us to be able to continue on, survive, and provide, right? In the sense that on the left-hand path, they believe that certain people need to be sacrificed. If you're not following in line and you're not working, then you don't exist, and you are not contributing, and therefore you are not a member of this society. And sorry, but I'm not sorry. You will ultimately go into your roots, which you could say Jesus supposedly said, all things go back into their roots, right? And you could say that is an extremely Stoic statement into itself. So when you're looking at the pure Son, you're looking at the manifestation of a spiritual energy that can exist through man, but that man is incapable of transcending this sort of Stoic notion.